Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Christine Mark, the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development. Thank you for joining us for today's screening of Steamboat Bill Jr. This special event is limited to the first 250 guests. To introduce the film, Community Engagement Manager Amanda Harrison will be joined by Film Curator Elliot Wilhelm. The method we are using today to grant access to the film is a little bit different than before. So please take note, and Amanda's going to walk you through the steps to access the film, and we'll take any questions you have during the program. To ask a question, please log in to your Gmail account through YouTube or leave a comment on this Facebook post. And here to share more is Amanda and Elliot. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I really appreciate the introduction and want to thank Elliot for being here to take questions about the film as well. Hey, Elliot.
How's it going, Amanda?
Good. So just to start us off today, I want to share my screen because I want to walk you through every step in this process to access the film today. So I'm making it sound more complicated. I promise it's not as bad as it sounds, and it's so worth it. So on your screen right now and in the chat boxes, you should see a link to the film that I'm going to copy and paste in my URL right here. So that's shared to you. You can click it right from the link in that chat that we've shared. I'm going to put it in my URL and hit enter. So that way, of course, it doesn't work when I try and do it. That's why I said this is complicated, right?
It's live.
All right, so that's going to take me to this main page where I'm going to have to log in. And if you don't already have an account, you're going to have to create one. Because I've already watched the film in advance, I have an account. You can see my DIA email address here. I created a password. You're going to need to do the same with that login button right up here that you can see on the top. I'm going to hit log in. That'll take me to this screen where the DIA is presenting Steamboat Bill Jr. You'll have some information. I've already got the film queued up because I've already rented it. But on your screen, right under the film poster here, you're going to see a blue button that says something like Rent Now. Once you click that, it's going to prompt you to enter a code. That code is being shared on the screen. The code was also shared in the chat boxes here. And that's what's going to grant you access to the film, which you can then watch right here on your screen. So if you have any questions about this process throughout the discussion today, Elliot and I are going to be chatting for the next half hour. I want to really encourage you to please reach out and we'll help you. We'll answer these questions and address any concerns that you have because we want you to see this film. It's brilliant. Elliot always has the best choices. And I'm so glad that he's here with us today to talk about it. What will you set the stage for us? What's this film about?
Oh, sure. And just before I do, I believe, just to add some confusion to everything, I believe that blue. Nope, you didn't miss it. But I think the blue button says Redeem Pass.
Okay.
And when you click on that, that's when you enter the, I think, 7-letter code that was just on your screen. But anyway, that's all I meant to say. We don't want people to pay for this because when you rent it by redeeming the pass and entering your code, you'll be renting it for free. So yes, that's what we want you to do.
Thanks, Elliot. It's so important
not
to
a
reiterate
problem.
that.
I was telling Amanda just before the show began that the complications of getting to see Steamboat Bill Jr. are, of course, as Amanda said, worth it. But on the other hand, they kind of parallel the movie in terms of complexity of what our hero, Steamboat Bill Jr. or Little Willie, Buster Keaton, has to go through in order to achieve his heroic feats at the end of this 69-minute feature, which is one of Keaton's greatest movies, and builds in a way in terms of storytelling to a climax that lasts 15 minutes, but it is probably, and I can include modern movies too, including Marvel superheroes movies and just about anything you'll see on screen, as spectacular and possibly more so than anything you can see in one of today's films, because everything you're seeing is actually happening. Granted, you're seeing props that aren't necessarily as heavy as an actual house when it appears to be falling on somebody, and you'll see winds that are artificially created by wind machines that are off camera during this incredible cyclone sequence toward the end of the film. But nevertheless, those are all real winds. Those are all, it's all real water. It's all real houses, real boats, real locations, and real sequences where this was photographed. And that was part of Buster Keaton's ethos. It's what he brought to the movies in a way that other filmmakers had not, and certainly had not for the purpose of comedy. There were spectacles prior to Buster Keaton coming to the movies, but many of those were things like the spectacles of the mid to late 1950s films, like The Ten Commandments, which was first made as a silent film by Cecil B. DeMille, who you'll see a photograph of in a little while in a different context, to try and present dramatic historical spectacles. Films like D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, in which there's a whole Babylonian sequence that has been recreated at the corner of Hollywood and Highland Boulevards as a shopping center in Los Angeles, as a tribute to this spectacle that Griffith created in 1916. But Keaton used spectacle and grandeur in a very different way, to make fun of it, but also to make use of it and to bring something new to the movies. You have to remember that when Steamboat Bill Jr. was made in 1928, the movies were, for all practical purposes, only about, as we know them, as a storytelling medium, less than 30 years old. So everybody was inventing ways to tell stories. And like now, and if Amanda were to ask me why I picked this film,
one of my favorite questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a commercial on TV right now that said, right now, everybody could use a pancake. And I feel like right now, everybody can use a comedy. There's almost no excuse to not be able to take an hour or an hour and 20 minutes and laugh and find a way to distract ourselves, but also to feel connected with how artists have handled catastrophe and the image of catastrophe throughout history, and have come through it with flying colors. Buster Keaton, and I'll try to be brief, but it's hard to be brief when talking about the great Buster, also known as the Great Stone Face. And if you've never seen one of his films, you'll see why. His expression seems to barely change from one sequence to the other.
I think we have a couple images of that too, to share.
It's one of the reasons that audiences of the 1920s who went to Buster Keaton movies and who were also going to see the films of other of the great silent comics, people like Charles Chaplin, of course, Harold Lloyd, people who are lesser known now, like Harry Langdon and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. They were choosing the kinds of comics that they liked, but there was a lot of comedy appearing on the screen. And one of the reasons, which may not have even been realized at the time, was that until 1927, 28, around the time Steamboat Bill Jr. was made, the movies were an exclusively silent medium. And it turns out that the silent era was a great fertile ground for visual comedy. And many of the great comics that we know now who began in the silent era began in vaudeville. Charles Chaplin probably being the most famous, and Chaplin's greatest films we don't tend to think of as quote cinematic, unquote. We don't remember great shots or great imagery from Chaplin's films, including films like The Gold Rush or The Kid, maybe a little more so Modern Times. But in his early comedies, what Chaplin's great films were all about was Charlie Chaplin. It was about watching him move, watching him emote, watching his small movements, watching how gracefully he would handle the most humiliating of circumstances that his character, the little tramp, would be placed in. It almost seems to not matter how they were photographed or how they were edited, because you can't take your eyes off of Chaplin himself. Other comics had specialties. They had more elaborate plots, in a sense. Harold Lloyd would do all kinds of physical stunts. He would climb on the sides of buildings and almost fall off of things. I mean, he really engaged in some spectacular things, especially considering that he had 8 fingers and nevertheless did all of his climbing and all of his stunts by himself. Audiences expected that. There were stunt people who did things, but they generally didn't replace the stars in some of these great comedies. When it came to Keaton, he was a true visionary who imagined something grander than just having people watch his routines photographed. He came from vaudeville. His parents, Joe and Myrna Keaton, took Buster out when he was an infant on their vaudeville circuit acts from town to town. And it introduced Buster to show business, but it also introduced him to some of the worst aspects of show business. His father was a heavy drinker. They were never all that financially stable in the family. And when they had Buster, they sort of didn't know what to do with him. And they actually did things that they may not have realized were going to be all that harmful to him. He was born, by the way, with the name Joseph. Buster was treated kind of like baggage almost. In fact, when his parents were doing their vaudeville act on stage, they famously would put Buster in a trunk where you would keep costume. And they accidentally locked him in the trunk once. The trunk was backstage. People were supposed to keep an eye on the trunk, not on little Buster, who wasn't named Buster until a few years after that. Once he was supposedly locked in a trunk with a ventriloquist dummy, which is enough to give PTSD, I would think, to any kid, let alone one who's in show business. And I mention that in particular because there is a ventriloquist dummy that shows up at a key moment in the film you're going to see or have just seen, Steamboat Bill Jr. And it's the one moment in the film in which Keaton appears genuinely scared by something that he runs into.
But there's a few autobiographical references within this film, aren't there, Elliot?
Quite a few, including the Cyclone itself. The Cyclone is the last 15 minutes of Steamboat Bill Jr. It was originally conceived to be a flood, but the film is set in Mississippi, and there were real floods that were taking place at the time filming was supposed to start. And the filmmaker decided, and who the filmmaker is, by the way, is really Buster Keaton, despite the fact that a man named Chuck Reiser is listed as the director. It was a contractual agreement. He was pretty much director in name only. This film was conceived and directed by and starring the one and only Buster Keaton. But he decided
I was reading that. That's so interesting that he didn't get creative credit for it. Wasn't this the last film that he had where he did have writing and directorial influence?
Yes, and ironically, it was the last of his independent productions. He was a part of the United Artists family, which was begun originally in the late teens by the actors Douglas Fairbanks and his wife Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and the director who I mentioned earlier, D.W. Griffith, who decided that they wanted to be free from studio influence and be artists who united and made films according to their vision. Problem was, there was a reason that the studio system often worked, and that was a financial reason. And pretty soon, finances were spinning out of control, as they did for Keaton, who had made, this was his third feature film made independently, and his last, before being shunted over to MGM, which would control what remained of his career over the next few years. And this film, like the huge hit that preceded it, The General, lost money. And you can see a lot of the money that was spent on the film on the screen. But part of that was because, as I was mentioning earlier, audiences didn't necessarily warm up, feel an emotional connection with Buster Keaton, because he seemed so deadpan so much of the time. He seemed to be startled by looking at what was going on in the world. He wanted the girl, but didn't know how to get the girl, and didn't try in as earnest a way, say, as Charlie Chaplin, so you didn't feel as much pain if something didn't work out right. But things generally did work out right for Buster Keaton, but his character was based on the humor of someone who doesn't appear to be in action and yet achieves the most extraordinary physical results in his movies by simply confronting natural movement in some way, or machines, or weather, as in the case of Steamboat Bill Jr.
And I think we see an excellent example of that in the film too, Elliot. Do you want to talk about that scene where I guess he's not moving, but he stands perfectly still,
which is what he had to do.
One of the most iconic scenes, I think, in history, because I've seen this recreated so many different times. Let's just watch it now. The precision that it takes to perform a stunt like this. And is this the first time a stunt's ever been done like this, Elliot?
Certainly on this scale.
Wow.
And the other thing, and by the way,
he doesn't even
all of that is,
flinch.
I know, and it's all real. There was no way to do a digital effect. There was no way to superimpose an image on top and have Buster standing under it. It wouldn't have convinced audiences, even in 1928. He insisted that all of these things be done for real, and you could only do that shot once, because
was
the whole set
dangerous. It looks dangerous.
Destroyed. It just fell forward, and you have to build a whole new set and do it again. And
we're not dealing with styrofoam here.
No. And if Buster were an inch off, or the front of the building took a bad spill and fell in a direction that wasn't absolutely anticipated, either by wind or because the stagehand let go of one of the cables at the wrong time, he could have been killed. And he was very often in that kind of danger. In a studio production, a full-fledged studio production with that kind of overhead, Buster Keaton would never have been allowed to do stunts like that. The insurance companies never would have permitted him to take that kind of risk, and they would have had it shot from a great distance with a particularly stunt performer, not the star of the movie, putting himself into that kind of danger. He did that frequently in
Why did he do that? Wasn't he worried about his own life and safety?
Yeah, but he was pretty sure of what he was doing. And he was creating an art form that was unique in terms of being the only one of these great silent comics who actually wanted to use film itself, to use what film could do to create his comedy and build that around him. He was, in a sense, a viewer sitting in a theater, watching all of these things happen and not knowing how they worked. We go to a movie sometimes and we're dazzled by what happens. Keaton wanted his leading man, Buster Keaton, to experience life in that way, to be a spectator around whom all of these incredible things happened, but somehow didn't harm him. And somehow he found ways to ingeniously use in order to get himself out of scrapes, or in this case, to rescue a lot of people at the end of the movie, and to also give audiences something so spectacular that they couldn't get it anywhere else. And doubly spectacular because it's unexpected in a comedy. It's something that we would expect in a film about the legend of Siegfried, or a film about the Civil War, or some kind of huge biblical spectacle. But
absolutely.
to have
that
Cyclone
stone face,
like that.
yeah, that stone face he wears, I was just going to mention, plays into that sense of removal from what he's doing too. It almost adds to that character of him that you're describing.
Very much so, and I think it also, on a perhaps not just subconscious level, is something that many of us can identify with. We go through life every day. We see things happening. I mean, for the last 2 years, we've been seeing things happen in the world that are so astounding and alarming, and things that we can't control, so much of it, that we look at it like Buster Keaton does. We kind of hope that when the wall or the house falls down, a window will land just over us. And some days it feels like that. We've all used the expression, gee, I just dodged that bullet. The ultimate expression of that is any great Buster Keaton film in which this little person, actually an inch shorter than I am, was Buster Keaton, goes through these incredible physical trials, and we want him to succeed. And he does it almost without effort until at the end, as in Steamboat Bill, he ties together in his head all of the mistakes that he's made earlier in the film and uses them for a purpose that probably nobody else would have thought of. And that's probably because he's not dumb, he's calm, but he's also capable of thinking in multiple dimensions. He did things that in a film, for example, called Sherlock Jr., he plays a projectionist, a movie theater projectionist who falls asleep and imagines suddenly that he's in the movie that he's projecting. And he hops in and out from behind the screen into the theater seamlessly as things that are projected suddenly turn into real life. No comic filmmaker until Keaton thought of things like this. And he insisted that it would be a disservice to the movies if they were done badly. So he became an almost totally tunnel vision obsessed perfectionist about getting all of his stunts right. And yes, he knew they were dangerous. In one of his great films, he has a scene where he's supposed to come out of the spout of a big water tower that's where a train is pulling into a station. He got the shot, he came out of the water tower, he hit the ground, and in real life, the actor, Buster Keaton, broke his neck during that shot. He knew something was wrong. He thought that might be it, but he also knew that he could still move. He got up and finished the scene. And that's the scene that's used. They didn't do another take. That's the scene that's used in the film. And he later had to go into traction, and his whole relationship with his body was slightly different after that, but he recovered.
And that didn't end his career or anything. He kept going after that.
No, it didn't. What ended his career was the sound era, combined with his alcoholism and a lot of financial decisions that were not great, not to mention relationship issues. He had a wonderful voice, as it turns out. The rumor was always that silent actors were all destroyed when sound came in because they had weird voices. Buster had this great gravelly voice that was absolutely an audio version of his stone face expression. He talked.
I'm glad that it fit.
If you wanted to imagine how Buster Keaton in the silent era sounded, once sound came in and you could hear him, that was it. But when sound came in, cameras were different. The way movies were made was completely different. These cameras became huge. They had to be in great big stationary boxes that were soundproofed, so that the microphone didn't pick up any external sounds, and they became not mobile any longer. If you look at Steamboat Bill, the camera's moving all over the place. And during the Cyclone sequence, there are all kinds of different ways in which he records the action. Once sound came in, it was
filmed on an actual river, right? Not the Mississippi River, but it was based. It's supposed to take place on the Mississippi. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. But no, he didn't shoot it in actual locations. But the fact is that it was shot on locations. It was not shot in a studio. There were a couple of scenes in the film, like the scene during the Cyclone where he runs into a theater, was shot in a movie studio set. But that makes perfect sense because that's where he's supposed to be. But for the most part, in films like this, films like Seven Chances, where Buster finds out that he's going to inherit $1 million, but only if he gets married by 7 p.m. that day. So he finds a way to send the word out that he's looking for a bride because he's going to become a millionaire. All these women come running after him, and he has to run down this huge hill, and there are boulders coming after him, plus all these women who want to marry him. And this chase is photographed with a moving camera as he runs down the hill. It couldn't have been done during the sound era, at least the first few years of the sound era, simply because the equipment and the way movies were made was completely different. So he was perfect for his time. And he asked a lot of audiences. When you watch Steamboat Bill, you'll see it assembling this story of two families. His riverboat captain father, whose boat is sort of broken down, and so is his father, and this other successful businessman, King, who owns a hotel, and he owns lots of different businesses, and also has the snazzy new riverboat in town. He immediately is at odds with the person who played Keaton's father, an actor named Ernest Torrence. But the complication is a Romeo and Juliet style Montague and Capulet situation in which young Buster, really young Steamboat Bill, is quite enamored of, as is she, the daughter of the rich guy. So neither father wants them to get together because they hate each other. So Buster has to take care of that and somehow make the romance happen, and also physically rescue everybody from this cyclone. You mentioned the cyclone in his real life. This was actually an outgrowth of the fact that his parents kept him in a trunk backstage when they were doing their act. At a certain age, they finally, I think 4, they couldn't keep him in a trunk anymore, and they found a rooming house nearby. They were born in Kansas, by the way, so Buster was used to this kind of like flat, dusty landscape. They put him in a rooming house, and during one of their performances one afternoon at the Vaudeville Theater, a cyclone. They thought it was just a lot of wind, but it turned out to be, tornado-style cyclone / hurricane, disastrous situation. And the parents of little Buster ran to the rooming house. The roof had been blown off. They ran upstairs, and the door to the room where little Buster was supposed to be safely kept was shut by the air pressure that had blown something against the door. By the time they broke in, they looked in the room and there was no Buster.
Oh.
And little Buster, it turns out, was sucked out the window of his room at the rooming house and was carried 4 blocks on the winds and was set down in a field rather gently. And he was fine. The whole scene, one could say, if you were just an armchair psychologist or analyst of any kind, you could say, well, that explains everything. That explains why this kid, if he could remember this at the age of 4, would have a memory of such a thing happening and want to tell the world in every one of his films that these kinds of extraordinary physical occurrences that you somehow miraculously get through, that when the wall falls down, you're still standing just because you happen to be in exactly the right spot. This happened to young Buster, who was named Buster, by the way, nicknamed Buster, and the nickname stuck by none other than Harry Houdini, who was a part of the vaudeville act before he became super famous, part of the vaudeville act of the elder Keatons. And young Buster actually fell down a flight of stairs during an act one day. And I guess it was like a particularly violent series of bad bounces that he took. But again, Buster was fine. And Harry Houdini said, wow, it's incredible that he's okay, because that fall was a real Buster. And it was that expression that kind of stuck to him as a nickname. And he kept it throughout his life.
He does. I kept thinking in this film that he looked like rubber. Just the way that his body moved sometimes.
He's an incredible, a lot of the silent comics, it's true, have Chaplin is always thought of as a dancer because his moves were always so elegant and eloquent and poetic. And Buster is also somebody whose body does extraordinary things. And sometimes it alarms people. When he's entertaining a baby at the beginning of the film, and his father doesn't realize that there's a baby around the corner, he just sees Buster doing, little dance steps and thinks he's entertaining himself. The father really begins to worry about the mental state of his kid, who's also come back from college wearing a beret. He doesn't like any of these things. They're not manly enough for him. And ultimately, Buster proves what manliness is all about, in his view, which is to take charge and to rescue and to do the best you can in the most alarming of circumstances.
Which he
but
does
the fact
at
that he
the very
survived, the fact that he survived this era is really incredible, and lived to age 70, and was always remembered, and had small roles throughout the rest of his life in films. Was remembered by other movie people.
Right, because he went on afterwards to have, after this film, to have a long and successful career. Can you tell me, if we're all Buster Keaton fans in the audience here, what else of his should we be checking out after the film today?
Oh gosh, there are so many great films of his. I mean, here you're seeing an image of Charles Chaplin putting on his makeup in a 1952 magnificent latter stage Chaplin film called Limelight, about an old vaudevillian who's afraid to give it up. And rather poignantly, in his dressing room is another old vaudevillian who is watching him and part of the act, and that is Buster Keaton, who you see in the background there. Keaton showed up in a similar kind of role in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard as one of the old forgotten actors who played cards at Gloria Swanson's house, and was commented on very rudely by the lead, Bill Holden, in the film as one of those old mummies who sat around the house all the time. Here he is in a party, a rap party for Sunset Boulevard. It's Gloria Swanson and Cecil B. DeMille. In the middle is Bill Holden in the back, and you can see Buster. I'm sure they said smile. That was it for Buster. That was his expression. It didn't change from 1923 or 4.
I think you said he was in character all the time.
All the time. But interviews with Buster Keaton, conversations with Buster Keaton later in life show that he knew exactly what he was doing. And he is also credited with so many people, from Steven Spielberg to, of course, the great Jackie Chan, who is considered one of the great modern action artists in movie history, the Hong Kong action star who has had every bone in his body broken by doing stunts that he said, if I had a stuntman do them or had them be special effects, my fans wouldn't come to see them. His hero, of course, was Buster Keaton. And he remained the hero of many people. He had been forgotten during a long period of time between the early 1930s up through the late 1940s. But then he began to creep back into movies, sometimes in smaller roles, but always in a role that was similar to the character that we know. As you saw an earlier image from the 1949 film In the Good Old Summertime with Judy Garland, he was a reassuring presence. And the year before he died, he had become a staple in those beach movies with Frankie and Annette that kids in the 1960s went to see in drive-ins. Here's a shot from him, a publicity shot from How to Stuff a Wild Bikini in 1966. He's wearing the same sort of pork pie hat that he wore in many of his most famous films. And
which I love that you point that out too, Elliot, because isn't there a scene in the film where his father's trying to change his hat because he hates the beret, and don't we see his signature iconic hat in that scene? He tries it on and then quickly tosses it aside.
Yep.
I love seeing all those references to his personal life throughout this film.
I totally agree, and people knew him from that. His final screen appearance was in a film that was released about 7 months after his death. It was the Richard Lester screen adaptation of the Stephen Sondheim musical, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And I remember seeing the movie back in 1966 when it first opened. Yes, I'm that old. Um,
I was
and
going to say it.
when Buster came on the screen, there was applause in the theater. And that was really remarkable because it had been a long time since silent films existed. And yet people remembered him and they loved him. And what's really gratifying in my eyes is how his stock has risen over the decades among filmmakers and among film critics. They recognize that he was reinventing the power and possibilities of cinema to bring surreal situations to life. And they wouldn't have been done as successfully had he not insisted on everything in those images being solid and real. When you see him leaning into the wind in the Cyclone sequence at the end of Steamboat Bill, he's not being held up by strings. He's not artificially enhanced in
I
any
wondered
way.
that.
He's leaning into a
Wow.
wind that's almost impossible to withstand. And he's doing it with comic timing. He falls and he does the splits and pumps himself up again in the middle of all of this. He won't let any possibilities go by. Even in
Well,
the scene when he grabs onto a tree and flies in the way that he did when he was a baby, there's a crane holding up the tree that you can't really see. But it's not a fake scene. He's actually flying over this river and flying over the landscape. He's just figured out a way to get the camera to really follow him. It's that realism and the surreal quality of what's happening that combines to make his films unique in all of cinema. And I'm just glad that he's been remembered and that his work's still around to appreciate.
It is incredible, and just recently restored too into 4K. Is that what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, it's a beautiful restoration. A lot of Keaton films have been very carefully cared for over the years. This restoration that people will be seeing, if they go through all of the little tricks that they have to do in order to make it work, is worth seeing. And if you have a device at home that can stream onto a big flat screen TV, like a Roku device or Chromecast or something like that, it's worth doing because you can see all of the detail in the movie, and it will make it all the more startling for you. Going through all of those
Absolutely.
steps someday, we will all be able to just all we'll have to do is walk into a theater and plop down and watch again.
But I feel
and
lucky that right now we can offer this for free to you, so you can enjoy it in the comfort of your own home. And it's a couple extra steps this time, but so well worth it. We've got the link on the screen right now. I have shared that in the chat box too. I'm going to share it again right now just for your convenience. So use this link to go to Kino Marquee's website. You're going to need to create an account, register to be a part of it if you're not already. And then you're going to be asked to provide, you're going to click the link. What did it say, Elliot? Redeem.
I think it says redeem
now.
Redeem pass.
Redeem pass. Okay,
Yeah.
That's going to be on the
And that code
left-hand
is your
side,
pass.
right after, like right under the movie poster, which you can see on our screen right now. I'm going to share that code again in the chat box. So that way you can just copy and paste right from there. And if you have any questions, we wanted you to use this time to please ask. But I think we promised our audience we'd keep it at about a half an hour. So Elliot, I really appreciate you. We're right on time. And I am so grateful that you took this time to chat with us today. And I'd also just like to thank, we have our producers, Gavin, with us today, and Christine. Thank you so much for your efforts in making this program possible. We hope that our audience enjoys Steamboat Bill Jr. And just as a reminder, next week we will be talking with Judy Bowman at a studio visit, a very special event. We're back on Thursday at 1 p.m. and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.